The children who spoke French. The child spoke one sentence, and the room went silent. Sheriff Thomas Beckett had questioned hundreds of people in his life. Criminals, runaways, plantation owners, desperate widows, liars and truth-tellers alike. But never had a single voice stopped his thoughts cold the way this one did. The girl sitting across from him could not have been more than 9 years old. Her feet barely touched the wooden floor. She wore a simple cotton dress, the kind enslaved children wore across Texas in 1854. Her hair was tied back neatly. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. She looked ordinary, until she spoke. Je ne comprends pas ce que vous dites, monsieur. Her French was perfect, clean, educated, elegant. It was the kind of French Beckett had heard once in his youth from a visiting European trader in New Orleans. Not broken, not mixed, not the rough Creole French of the Gulf. This was refined, almost aristocratic. Sheriff Beckett felt a chill crawl up his spine. He slowly turned his head toward the man who had brought the child in. Richard Hartley was a plantation owner from outside Galveston. A thick neck, red face, the look of a man used to being obeyed. Right now his jaw was clenched so tightly it trembled. She will not speak English, Hartley said. Not one word. I bought her 3 weeks ago at auction in Houston. Since the moment I brought her home she has spoken nothing but French. Perfect French. Beckett looked back at the child. She met his eyes without fear. Where did she come from? Beckett asked. Hartley slammed his fist against the arm of the chair. That is the problem. The auctioneer swore she was born in East Texas. American born. No Louisiana history. No French blood. Nothing. The papers are clean. But listen to her. Beckett asked the girl another question in English. Slowly, calmly, she shook her head. Je suis désolé. Je ne comprends pas. Deputy Marshal James Crawford stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He had been listening quietly. His face had gone pale. How many does this make now? Crawford asked. Beckett did not answer right away. 7, he said finally. 7 children in 2 years. Different counties. Different sellers. Same age range. 6 to 12. All speaking only French. And all raised the same strange way. What Beckett did not say out loud was what truly haunted him. Every single one of these children had vanished from their original plantations when they were very young. Always before the age of 4. And years later they reappeared at slave auctions across Texas with no memory of where they had been. No memory of who they were. Only the language. Someone was taking these children. And whatever happened during those missing years was something no one wanted to look at too closely. Because slavery made it easy to hide people. The first case had come to Beckett in the spring of 1852. At the time he thought it was just a strange mistake. A cotton planter named William Garrison had purchased an 8-year-old boy at the Houston slave market. The child looked healthy, strong for his age. The trader promised he was Texas-born and already trained for field work. The price was lower than expected. Within 3 days, Garrison was furious. The boy would not respond to English commands. When spoken to, he answered in rapid French. When forced into the fields, he panicked. He cried. He clutched his head as if the sound of English hurt him. Garrison had some education. He had served briefly in the Mexican-American War. He had heard educated men speak French. This boy spoke like a diplomat's son. Not a word out of place. Not a single accent flaw. Garrison demanded answers. The trader, Marcus Webb, swore the boy was born on a plantation in Cherokee County. Both parents were field workers. Neither spoke French. The paperwork was legal. The trail ended there. Months later, it happened again. This time in Austin. Martha Keene was a widow who ran a boarding house. She bought a 10-year-old girl to help in the kitchen. By nightfall she was standing before a magistrate shaking with fear. The girl spoke only French. Beautiful French. Martha Keene had studied French in Virginia. She knew the difference. This child spoke better than her teachers ever had. Judge Henry Morton listened carefully. And instead of dismissing it, he began asking questions. That was when he wrote to Sheriff Beckett. Because by then, Beckett had already begun to suspect the truth. This was not coincidence. This was not fraud. This was something organized. Something hidden. Something that could only exist in a system where children were property and questions were dangerous. And as Beckett would soon learn, the answer was not buried underground. It was standing openly in Texas. Protected by law, protected by silence, and protected by fear. If you want to know what Judge Morton discovered, if you want to learn where these children disappeared to, and what happened during those lost years, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Like this video if the story pulled you in. Share it with someone who loves dark history. And leave a comment below with your thoughts or theories. Part 2 reveals the letter that changed everything. Part 2. The years that went missing. The letter arrived just after sunrise, and Sheriff Thomas Beckett knew something was wrong the moment he broke the seal. Judge Henry Morton was not a man who used dramatic language. Every letter he had ever sent was careful, calm, and precise. But this one was different. The handwriting was tighter, the ink heavier in places, and the first line sent a cold weight straight into Beckett's chest. The girl was born in Washington County. There is no doubt about that. Beckett sat down slowly and began to read. According to Morton's investigation, the child had been born on a small farm owned by the Sutton family. She had lived there from birth until just after her 3rd birthday. The Suttons remembered her clearly. She spoke English like any other child. She laughed. She played. Nothing about her stood out as unusual. Then she was sold. The reason was simple and painfully common. Debt. The Suttons' eldest son had fallen into financial trouble. Crops failed. Notes came due. A decision was made that the family would rather forget. The child was sold to cover the loss. The buyer was a man named Daniel Foster. That was where everything began to fall apart. Foster claimed he represented a plantation in Brazoria County. He paid well above market price. He was polite, well-dressed, educated. He did not browse or negotiate. He asked one question. Do you have any children between 3 and 4 years old? He did not want adults. He did not want teenagers. Only a child of that age. The Suttons sold her. And then she vanished. Beckett felt his hands tighten as he read. Morton had followed every paper trail he could find. Foster's plantation did not exist. The address led to an abandoned property. Foster himself appeared in no census. No land registry. No tax rolls. It was as if the man had stepped into Texas for one purpose and then stepped back out of existence. For nearly 4 years the girl did not exist on paper. No bills of sale. No transport records. No estate lists. Nothing. Then suddenly she appeared again. Older. Changed. She was sold at an auction in Bastrop County by a trader who claimed she came from an estate sale in East Texas. There was no explanation for where she had been. No explanation for why she now spoke perfect French. Morton's letter continued. I interviewed the Sutton family personally. They were shocked by what became of her. But what disturbed me most was their description of Foster. He specifically sought a child of that age. He paid far above value. This was no casual purchase. This was intentional. Beckett lowered the letter. One case could be dismissed. 2 suggested coincidence. But this was planning. Within days Beckett wrote back, asking Morton to document every detail. Then he began writing letters of his own. To sheriffs, marshals, judges, anyone he trusted. Quietly, carefully. What came back over the next few months made sleep difficult. By early 1853, Beckett had confirmed 5 cases across Texas. Houston, Austin, Galveston, small towns near the Louisiana border. Different children, different sellers, same pattern. Each child appeared between the ages of 6 and 10. Each spoke only French, not broken French, not learned from a neighbor, but refined educated French. Every record showed a gap. 3 years, 4 years, sometimes 5 years where the child did not exist. Beckett finally managed to interview 3 of the children with the help of French-speaking merchants and sailors from Galveston. What the children said stayed with him long after the words faded. They all remembered being taken. Not violently, not screaming. They remembered a wagon, a long ride, then a house, a large house with many rooms. They described lessons, long days spent learning French, reading, writing, memorizing poems and songs, speaking only French from morning to night. They were fed well, dressed cleanly, not beaten, but watched, always watched. They remembered other children, many of them, boys and girls, all learning the same things, all the same age. But when Beckett asked where this house was, they could not say. No rivers, no towns, no landmarks. The memories existed without place. Like a dream. One girl told the interpreter it felt like she had stepped outside the world for a while. Then one day the lessons stopped. No explanation. They were taken away and placed in trader pens. Surrounded by shouting, chains, English words they no longer understood. When Beckett asked why they were taught French, none of the children knew. When he asked what they were told about the future, they shook their heads. No one explained anything. The education simply ended. Beckett shared everything with Judge Morton and Deputy Marshal Crawford. The 3 men met late at night with maps spread across a table. Someone is taking young enslaved children and educating them in French, Crawford said quietly. Keeping them for years, then selling them back into slavery. Why? Morton asked. What purpose does that serve? And why does no one question the missing children? Beckett replied. Because legally they were sold. No crime, no theft, just property changing hands. Beckett pulled out a map. He had marked every known case. Look here, he said. The original purchases formed a rough circle across central and eastern Texas. But all centered around one region. About 80 miles northwest of Houston. Then he marked where the children reappeared. They never came back near where they were taken. Someone was careful, very careful, to prevent recognition, Crawford said slowly. Yes, Beckett replied. Parents, former owners, other enslaved people, anyone who might remember the child. Morton leaned back in his chair. Then whoever is doing this expects these children to return to the world changed. Changed enough to be unrecognizable. The room fell silent, because none of them yet understood the worst truth. That this was not charity, not education, not kindness. It was preparation. And in part 3, Sheriff Beckett discovers the hidden institution at the center of it all. If this story has pulled you in, make sure you subscribe. Like the video to support the channel. Share it with someone who loves dark forgotten history. And leave a comment below with your theory. Because what these children were being prepared for is far more terrifying than anyone imagined. Part 3. The house where children disappeared. Sheriff Thomas Beckett realized something was very wrong the moment the 2 children were brought into his office. Not because they were crying. Not because they were afraid. But because they were silent. The boy and girl stood side by side, hands folded, eyes lowered. They did not speak to each other. They did not look around the room. They looked like children who had learned long ago that attention brought consequences. A messenger stood nearby, breathless from his ride. 2 more, sir, he said. From Waller County, both speaking French. Bought from different traders less than a month apart. Beckett felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. 7 was no longer a pattern. It was proof. The plantation owner, Robert Thornton, stormed into the office moments later, red-faced and furious. He was a powerful man. Wealthy. Used to being heard. "I want my money back," Thornton snapped. "I want compensation, and I want whoever is responsible for this fraud arrested. These children are defective goods." Beckett ignored him. He had already arranged for Philippe Rousseau to be present. Rousseau was a French-speaking merchant from Louisiana who had helped translate before. When he entered the room, the children finally looked up. "Ask their names," Beckett said quietly. Rousseau spoke gently in French. The boy answered first. "Je m'appelle Thomas." The girl followed. "Louise." Beckett felt his pulse quicken. "Ask them where they learned French." The answer came easily. Too easily. "The house with many rooms." "The lessons." "The other children." Rousseau paused, then frowned. "Wait," he said softly. "He is saying something else." He turned to Beckett. "The boy says the man who taught them was named Monsieur Laurent." Beckett leaned forward. "Ask him to describe this man." What followed was the clearest description Beckett had heard yet. Monsieur Laurent was tall and thin. He dressed formally. Dark suits. Always clean. Always calm. He spoke French with what the boy called the proper accent. He was strict but fair. Never cruel. Never kind. Only focused. Then more names came. Madame Dubois taught reading and writing. Mademoiselle Claire taught poetry and songs. Real people. Real teachers. This was no rumor. This was a school. "Ask them how the lessons ended," Beckett said. The girl spoke this time. "One day Monsieur Laurent told them their education was complete. He said they were going to new homes. Then they were taken to market. No explanation. No goodbye." When Thornton finally left, still angry but distracted by Beckett's promise to investigate, the room fell quiet. Crawford spoke first. "Someone is running a school. A secret school for enslaved children." Rousseau shook his head slowly. "But why teach them only to return them to slavery? It makes them useless." Beckett stared at the wall. "What if that is the point?" Both men looked at him. "What if the goal is not to help these children?" Beckett said carefully. "What if someone is trying to prove something?" Before they could continue, new information arrived. A trader in Houston had been arrested after a violent altercation. His records were seized, and in those records was a phrase written again and again. "The French house." For the first time, Beckett had a location. The journey to Austin County took several days. Rolling prairie, dense oak woods, scattered plantations, isolation. The trader, Samuel Wyatt, admitted he had served as an intermediary. He spoke nervously. "I never saw the inside," he said. "I just moved paperwork. The lawyer handled everything." André Beaufort. Beckett noted the name but pressed on. On the third day, they found it. A large 2-story house hidden at the end of a long dirt road. Built in a style more common to Louisiana than Texas. Wide galleries, tall windows, silent, no smoke, no people, but not abandoned. The grounds were maintained. The structure was sound. They forced entry. Inside, Beckett felt something close to dread. The house was not a plantation. It was a school. Rows of desks, blackboards, shelves filled with French books, history, mathematics, literature, science. Upstairs were dormitories, small beds in neat rows. Children's clothing, clean, well made. This place had held dozens of children. In an office, Beckett found ledgers. Names, ages, dates, notes on aptitude and behavior. Clinical, detached. They had been doing this for nearly a decade. Then Crawford found letters. Rousseau translated as they read. The letters were between André Beaufort and someone identified only as L. Laurent. Beaufort wrote of funding from France. Abolitionists who believed slavery survived because of a lie. The lie that enslaved people were intellectually inferior. Laurent wrote of his students with pride. Of their brilliance. Of their curiosity. Of his doubt. One letter stopped Beckett cold. We cannot free them. We cannot protect them. But we can prove they are equal. When they speak, when they are seen, perhaps the world will be forced to confront the truth. Rousseau lowered the paper. They are using these children to make a political point. Beckett felt anger rise in his chest. They take children, teach them a glimpse of freedom, then throw them back into chains. Crawford whispered, even if they believe they are doing good, this is evil. And Beckett knew something else. This truth would not free the children. It would only make powerful enemies. Because exposing the French house meant challenging the very foundation of slavery itself. And that was something Texas would not forgive. In Part 4, Beckett must decide whether to expose the truth or bury it forever. If this story has gripped you, subscribe now. Like the video to support the channel. Share it with someone who loves dark hidden history. And leave a comment below with your thoughts. Because what happens next puts everyone in danger. Part 4. The truth no one wanted. The silence inside the French house felt heavier than any courtroom Beckett had ever stood in. Sheriff Thomas Beckett remained still, his hand resting on the edge of the desk where the letters lay scattered. Outside, cicadas screamed in the late Texas heat, but inside the house there was no sound at all. No footsteps, no voices, no children, only proof. This place should not exist, Crawford said quietly. Beckett nodded. Every instinct in him agreed. They spent the rest of the day cataloging everything. Names, dates, routes, payments. Every detail of the operation was written down with careful precision. It was clear this was not a reckless effort. It was methodical, thoughtful, cold. These people knew exactly what they were doing. By nightfall, Beckett understood something deeply unsettling. This investigation was no longer just about missing children. It was about power, and truth, and whether exposing that truth would destroy him. On the ride back to Galveston, none of the men spoke much. Each mile carried the weight of what they had uncovered. When Beckett finally sat alone in his office, he locked the door and reread Laurent's final letter. We cannot free them, but we can prove they are equal. The words burned. Equality meant danger. In Texas, in 1853, that idea was more threatening than any crime. Beckett summoned Judge Morton and Deputy Crawford 2 days later. He spread the documents across the table. This is enough to expose the entire operation, Morton said. Slowly. Names, locations, funding sources. If this goes public, it will shake the state. And if it does, Crawford added, men will die. They all knew it. Plantation owners would not tolerate proof that enslaved children were capable of refined education. That knowledge threatened the moral foundation of slavery. If the lie cracked, everything cracked. We cannot release this carelessly, Morton said. The backlash would be brutal. Beckett leaned back. And if we do nothing, children will keep being taken. That was the choice. Expose the truth and risk violence. Or bury it and become complicit. Before a decision could be made, the first warning arrived. A sealed note was slipped under Beckett's office door late one evening. It contained only one sentence. Sheriff Beckett should remember that curiosity has consequences. No signature. The next day, a fire broke out at a warehouse near the docks. It belonged to Philippe Rousseau. The damage was minimal, but the message was clear. Rousseau confronted Beckett that night. They know, he said. Someone knows we were at the house. Beckett felt the net tightening. Within a week, rumors spread through Galveston. Whispers that Beckett was meddling in abolitionist schemes. That he was questioning the natural order. That he was becoming dangerous. Men who once greeted him warmly now avoided his gaze. Then came the second warning. Deputy Crawford was ambushed on a road outside town. He survived, but barely. The attackers were never identified. That night, Beckett sat alone and understood the truth. The French house had not been abandoned. It had been abandoned on purpose. Laurent and Beaufort were gone. The school was closed. The children released. The experiment was over. And the people behind it were watching to see what Beckett would do next. He chose action. Quiet action. Instead of exposing everything publicly, Beckett sent copies of the evidence north. To judges, journalists, clergymen, men who questioned slavery but lived beyond Texas' reach. If this truth was going to surface, it would not begin here. Judge Morton agreed to help, though he knew it would end his career. Within weeks, Beaufort disappeared. His law office was emptied overnight. His name vanished from court dockets. Laurent was never found, but the consequences still came. Beckett was summoned before a state inquiry. He was accused of abusing his authority, of sympathizing with abolitionists, of endangering public order. The evidence he presented was dismissed as fabricated. The French house was declared a misunderstanding, a foreign-funded curiosity, closed and irrelevant. Beckett was not arrested, but he was warned, strongly. The investigation ends here. And officially, it did. But the children did not disappear from Beckett's mind. Years later, during the Civil War, Union soldiers would report encountering formerly enslaved men and women who spoke fluent French. Who could read? Who could write? Who remembered a house with many rooms? The experiment failed, and succeeded. Knowledge once given could not be erased. And that knowledge would help fuel the fire that eventually consumed slavery itself. But for the children, the cost was unbearable. They were proof. And proof is often sacrificed first. If you want to know what finally happened to Beckett and the last secret hidden in the ledgers, Part 5 reveals the aftermath that history tried to erase. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. Like the video to support the channel. Share this story with someone who loves hidden history. And leave a comment below with your thoughts. Because the real horror is not what was done in secret. It is what was allowed to continue in the open. Part 5. The Children Who Remembered Too Much. Years later, Sheriff Thomas Beckett would say that the most frightening thing about the French house was not what it did to the children. It was what it left behind. The investigation was officially closed by the winter of 1853. The ledgers were sealed. The letters were classified as dangerous material. Beckett was ordered to return to normal duties and forget everything he had learned. But forgetting was impossible, because the children were still out there. They had been scattered across Texas like seeds in dry soil. Some ended up on plantations. Some in kitchens. Some in fields where the sun burned their skin and the overseers' voices cut through the air. And they remembered. Not everything, but enough. The first sign came from Brazos County. A planter wrote to Beckett privately, asking for advice. He owned a young boy who spoke little English but could read French books with ease. The boy was quiet, observant. He asked questions no enslaved child was supposed to ask. Why do some men own others? Why are laws written? Why does God allow chains? The planter was unnerved. He wanted to know if the boy was dangerous. Beckett never replied. Then came word from a minister in Austin. He had encountered an enslaved girl who could read scripture in French and English. She corrected his pronunciation. She asked about the meaning of liberty. The minister said she frightened him. By 1854, Beckett began to see the pattern clearly. The children who had passed through the French house did not forget what they learned. Even when beaten, even when starved, even when punished for speaking, the knowledge stayed, and that knowledge made them visible. Too visible. Some were sold again because owners found them unsettling. Too thoughtful, too quiet, too aware. Others were broken deliberately. Beckett heard stories he could not confirm but could not dismiss. Children whipped for humming French songs. Hands scarred for writing letters in the dirt. Tongues threatened for speaking words no overseer could understand. The horror was not just the experiment. It was the aftermath. One night, Beckett received an unexpected visitor. It was Philippe Rousseau. He looked thinner, older. Fear lived behind his eyes. "They are being hunted," Rousseau said quietly. Beckett felt his chest tighten. "Who?" "Anyone who stands out. Anyone educated. Anyone who reminds their owners that enslaved people are human beings." Rousseau had made a decision. He was leaving Texas. "I have contacts in New Orleans. In the north. I can help some of them disappear." Beckett knew what that meant. The Underground Railroad. "If you are caught," Beckett warned. Rousseau nodded. "I know." Before he left, Rousseau said something that haunted Beckett for the rest of his life. Monsieur Laurent believed knowledge was a light that could not be extinguished. He was wrong. Light attracts fire, and fire destroys what it touches. In the spring of 1855, Beckett was removed as sheriff. No explanation was given. No charges filed. He was simply replaced. Unofficially, everyone knew why. He knew too much. Judge Morton fared no better. He resigned quietly and left the state. Crawford disappeared from public life altogether. The French house was never mentioned again. But history has a way of leaking. During the Civil War, Union officers reported something strange. Formerly enslaved men and women who spoke French. Who could read military orders. Who served as interpreters. Who organized quietly. Some became teachers. Some became leaders. Some vanished again. The experiment that was meant to prove a point had done something else entirely. It had planted ideas. Dangerous ideas. And those ideas did not die. Decades later, after slavery had fallen, a historian uncovered fragments of the French house story in forgotten archives. Ledgers without names. Letters without signatures. Mentions of children who spoke like Europeans. Most scholars dismissed it as myth. But a few believed. And one final document confirmed everything. A diary belonging to Thomas Beckett. In it, he wrote one last entry. They thought they were proving equality. But equality does not need proof. It exists whether men accept it or not. What they proved instead is that cruelty can wear the mask of kindness, and that children will always pay the price for adult ideas. The diary ended there. No record exists of Beckett's death. No grave. No marker. Only a story. And the children. Always the children. If you want to learn the final fate of the French house and the last truth hidden in its walls, Part 6 reveals the secret history that nearly vanished forever. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. Like the video to support the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark forgotten history. And leave a comment below. Because the most terrifying experiments are the ones that change the world quietly. Part 6. The secret that survived the war. The war did not erase the French house. It buried it. For years after Sheriff Thomas Beckett disappeared from public life, the story seemed to fade into rumor. Texas burned with conflict. Armies marched. Slavery shook but did not fall quietly. Records were lost. Courthouses burned. Names vanished. And that was exactly what the people behind the French house had counted on. But secrets have a way of surviving when truth is written into human memory instead of paper. In 1862, a Union scouting party moved through a ruined plantation near the Brazos River. The house had been abandoned in haste. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered. In the cellar they found a young man hiding. He surrendered without resistance. When the officer questioned him in English, the man shook his head. Then he spoke. Not in broken words. Not with fear. But in calm, precise French. The officer froze. The man introduced himself as Etienne. He was 20 years old. Born enslaved. Sold twice. Educated somewhere he could not fully describe. A house with many rooms. Lessons every day. poetry, maps, books. He had remembered. By the end of the war, stories like this reached Union headquarters again and again. Formerly enslaved people who could read French military manuals, who translated for officers, who taught other freed men and women how to read. They did not know each other, but they all remembered the same place. A house that did not exist. After the war, a northern historian named Samuel Whitmore began collecting these accounts. He was not looking for the French house. He was researching education among formerly enslaved populations. The stories found him. At first he dismissed them as coincidence. Louisiana influence, Creole culture. Then he noticed the details. The age range, the years missing from memory. The same names whispered again and again. Monsieur Laurent, Madame Dubois, Mademoiselle Claire. Whitmore began searching archives across the South. Most records were gone, burned or deliberately destroyed, but in Austin County he found something. A tax ledger that listed a property owned through a series of proxies. No names, no clear owner. The description matched. 2 stories, wide galleries, French architectural style. Whitmore traveled to the site in 1871. The house was gone, burned to the ground, but the foundation remained, and beneath it, buried carefully, he found a metal box. Inside were fragments. A child's exercise book filled with French handwriting. A lesson schedule. A single letter unsigned. The letter was simple. If these papers are found, then our work has already failed or succeeded. History will decide which. Whitmore realized the truth too late to change it. The French house was never meant to last. It was meant to leave evidence. The people behind it believed that once the proof existed, once educated enslaved children were seen, slavery would collapse under its own lies. They were wrong about timing, but not about outcome. The cost, however, was unbearable. Many of the children did not survive the return to bondage. Education made them targets. Knowledge made them dangerous. Some were beaten into silence. Some were sold south where no one knew their past. Some disappeared forever. And yet some survived. They became teachers during Reconstruction. Preachers. Translators. Quiet leaders. They never spoke publicly about the French house. They did not need to. The knowledge lived in how they moved. How they spoke. How they taught others to read. As for Sheriff Beckett, Whitmore searched for him until his own death. He found only one final trace. A letter sent from Ohio in 1866 to a small church in Galveston. The sender signed only T.B. The letter contained a donation and a short note. For the education of children who were denied it. No return address. Judge Morton died in Tennessee. Crawford was rumored to have crossed into Mexico. Laurent was never identified again. Beaufort vanished into Europe. The French abolitionists who funded the operation dissolved their society quietly after the war. No one was punished. No one was honored. The story faded again. Until now. Because the true horror of the French house was not its secrecy. It was its honesty. It proved that the system of slavery was built on a lie so fragile that even educating children threatened to destroy it. And it proved that good intentions can still cause unimaginable harm. In Part 7, a final witness comes forward with a memory no one expected. A memory that changes everything we thought we knew about the French house. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. Like the video to support the channel. Share this story with someone who loves dark hidden history. And leave a comment below. Because some truths wait generations before they are ready to be heard. Part 7. The Last Child Who Spoke. The letter arrived nearly 40 years too late. It was found in 1892, folded inside a family Bible in a small town outside St. Louis. The pages were brittle. The ink was faded. But the words were still clear enough to read. I was one of the children. Those 7 words reopened a door history had tried to seal forever. The letter was written by an elderly woman named Louise Morton. She claimed that as a child she had lived in a place she called the House of Lessons. She wrote in careful English, but every few lines her French slipped through, as if the language lived just beneath the surface of her thoughts. A local pastor sent the letter to a historical society, unsure what to make of it. One of the archivists recognized the name immediately. Louise. The same name recorded decades earlier by Sheriff Thomas Beckett. For the first time, one of the children had spoken freely. Louise Morton was nearly 50 when she decided to write. Freedom had come and gone. Reconstruction had failed. Jim Crow had risen. She had waited because she was afraid. Not of punishment. Of memory. She described the French house not as a prison but not as a home. It was quiet, controlled, clean. Every hour was planned. Every word was corrected. Monsieur Laurent watched everything. She wrote that he believed deeply in what he was doing. He spoke often about reason and equality. But he never asked what the children wanted. They were never told why they were there. Only that they must learn. Louise remembered the day she was taken. A wagon came early in the morning. Her mother cried. The man who took her smiled and said she was going somewhere important. That word stayed with her. Important. Inside the house, the children were not beaten. They were praised for learning. Rewarded for obedience. But affection was forbidden. No hugging. No comfort. No talking about home. Home was treated like a bad habit that had to be corrected. Louise wrote about nights when children cried quietly in their beds. About the way Laurent would stand in the doorway until the room fell silent. Education before emotion. Always. The most disturbing part of her letter came next. She remembered tests. Not exams on paper. Tests of forgetting. The teachers would ask questions about the children's past lives. Their parents. Their names before the house. When the children hesitated or forgot, Laurent smiled. When they remembered too clearly, they were punished. Not with pain. With isolation. Louise wrote that this was when she understood the true purpose of the house. They were not only being taught. They were being erased. Their old identities were meant to fade so the experiment would be pure. She wrote about the day the lessons ended. Laurent told them their education was complete. That they had been chosen for something meaningful. Then they were taken away. No ceremony. No farewell. She was sold 3 days later. Returned to a world that felt unreal. English sounded harsh. Loud. Wrong. Her owner thought she was slow. Broken. She learned quickly that speaking French brought punishment. So she hid it. She swallowed the words. She survived. Louise wrote that she never forgot. Not the language. Not the house. Not the feeling that something had been stolen from her that she could never name. After emancipation, she became a teacher in a small black school. She taught children to read. She taught them carefully, kindly. She never used French. She was afraid it would open the door again. At the end of her letter, she wrote one final sentence. They thought they were proving a theory. But they were playing with lives. The archivists compared her letter with surviving fragments from the French house. The details matched. The names. The routines. The silence. For the first time, the story had a voice from inside. Historians debated it fiercely. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others called it psychological trauma shaping memory. But a few understood the truth. The French house was not just an experiment in education. It was an experiment in control. It asked a terrifying question. Can identity be rewritten? And it answered yes. But at a cost no one measured. Louise Morton died 2 years after her letter was discovered. She was buried quietly. No marker mentioned her past. But her letter survived. And with it, the final proof that the children were never meant to be helped. They were meant to be evidence. In Part 8, the story takes a darker turn when a second witness comes forward with a memory that suggests the experiment did not end when the house closed. Subscribe now so you do not miss the next part. Like the video if this story moved you. Share it with someone who believes history still hides dangerous truths. And leave a comment below. Because the most frightening part of this story is what may have continued long after everyone stopped looking. Part 8. The shadows that followed. The French house may have been gone, but its shadows lingered. By 1895, a strange rumor began to circulate in small towns across Texas. Formerly enslaved children who had been educated in French were appearing unexpectedly in places no one thought they could reach. They were not children anymore. They were adults who carried a strange combination of refinement and fear. They remembered the house of lessons vividly, and those memories shaped every choice they made. Sheriff Beckett was long gone, as was Judge Morton. Deputy Crawford had disappeared into Mexico decades earlier. But the evidence of the experiment persisted, not in documents or letters, but in the lives of the people it had touched. One evening, a young teacher named Emile Bertrand arrived at a one-room schoolhouse in a remote corner of East Texas. He had traveled from New Orleans to avoid attention. His students were all black children, former enslaved or children of freedmen. But Emile carried a secret. He spoke French fluently. He could read texts that few in Texas even knew existed. And he had memories that terrified him. The day he arrived, one of his students asked about history. Emile froze. The question was innocent, but he realized that history, as he knew it, was dangerous. He had to be careful. The memory of the house of lessons was alive in him. Every shadow, every strict teacher, every lesson etched into his mind, was a warning. That night, he wrote in his journal. He described lessons in French, arithmetic, geography, poetry, and science. He remembered Monsieur Laurent. He remembered Madame Dubois and Mademoiselle Claire. And he wrote something that made him tremble. The experiments had continued. Even after the house closed, children had been secretly educated elsewhere. Small rooms, hidden properties, safe houses in towns where no one asked questions. Some of the children had vanished entirely. Others were sold into isolation. Many were returned to plantations where no one could understand the intelligence they carried. And all the while, the letters from Laurent and Beaufort indicated that the network was more extensive than Beckett had ever realized. Emile Bertrand realized that the house was not just a single building. It was a system, a plan that had spanned decades. And if it had survived the war, it could still be alive in hidden corners of Texas. He remembered one lesson that haunted him most. Laurent had written numbers on the board, then erased them quickly, asking the children to recall them without help. The goal was not mathematics. It was obedience. It was memory under pressure. It was the ability to retain knowledge while the world tried to erase it. Emile's memory of that day was vivid because he had never truly escaped the method. He could not forget. And he was not alone. Other survivors had reached similar conclusions. Some had become teachers themselves. Others had hidden. But all had carried the same lesson. Knowledge could survive chains, but survival demanded secrecy. By 1896, historians and local reporters had begun hearing whispers about French-speaking black adults appearing unexpectedly in small towns. They were described as unusually calm, unusually polite, and unnervingly intelligent. Some were teachers. Some were clerks. Some disappeared after a few months. The pattern matched the testimonies of Beckett, Rousseau, and Louise Martin. Then came a shocking revelation. A merchant in Houston discovered a ledger in a locked trunk of an old trading house. The ledger listed dozens of children, not just from the 1840s, but extending into the 1860s. The French house had not ended with the Civil War. Its methods had been replicated. The letters suggested that Laurent and Beaufort had trained others to continue their work. New locations had opened quietly in Louisiana, Mississippi, and even in the northern states. This realization terrified Émile. The French house was not just a story of the past. It was a living system, with potential to continue shaping lives decades after it was supposedly destroyed. He wrote in his journal that night, "The house may be gone, but the lessons remain. And the children who learn them carry the truth." It was during that same winter that Émile received a visitor. A man who identified himself as Henri, claiming to have been educated in one of the later schools. Henri spoke fluent French, English, and even a bit of Latin. He had traveled far to warn Émile. He said that those who knew too much were in danger. Plantation descendants, old families loyal to the pre-war order, were still searching for anyone who carried the legacy of Laurent's education. Henri said something that made Émile's blood run cold. "Knowledge leaves a trail, and they will follow it." Émile understood then that the horror of the French house had never been about the lessons. It had been about control. About making people into evidence. About shaping lives for the sake of an idea. The house had trained children to survive. It had trained them to hide. But it had also marked them forever. The night Émile closed his journal, he made a decision. He would carry the memory forward. He would teach children, not as experiments, but as human beings. And he would write the truth, in case history tried again to bury it. By 1897, whispers of the surviving children had spread to newspapers. A few articles mentioned French-speaking black adults in small Texas towns. Some claimed they were prodigies. Others suspected they were spies or radicals. No one connected the dots. No one understood the scale. But the network, in some form, had survived. Hidden, quiet, and deadly in its subtle power. In Part 9, the full scale of the French house's influence will be revealed. The connections, the surviving witnesses, and the last secrets hidden in the shadows of Texas. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. Like the video if you are fascinated by hidden history. Share this story with someone who wants to uncover the truth. And leave a comment below with your thoughts. Because some shadows never fade. And some secrets wait generations to be discovered. If you want, I can immediately continue with Part 9 in the same style, keeping the suspense and revealing the last surviving witnesses and their testimonies. Do you want me to do that next? Part 9. The Final Witness. The French house had left its mark. By the late 1890s, the story was no longer just whispers. Survivors, now adults, were stepping forward in scattered towns across Texas. Some spoke carefully, others reluctantly. And one man, the last known witness who could describe the house in full, changed everything. His name was Henri Leclerc. He had been taken at age 3 from a plantation near Galveston. He remembered the wagon, the journey, the sense of being lifted from the world he knew and placed somewhere utterly foreign. Henri described the house in precise detail. He remembered the high ceilings, the tall windows, the rows of small desks, the blackboards, the neatly made beds. He remembered the smell of chalk dust and polished wood. He remembered the quiet, the constant attention to every word spoken, every gesture, every mistake corrected. But most of all, he remembered Laurent. Laurent was not cruel in the way the overseers were. He did not strike or scream. He was calm, almost gentle. But his control was absolute. Every lesson, every correction, every exercise was a test of obedience, memory, and endurance. He believed in what he was doing. Laurent believed that children could be remade into evidence. Henri spoke of the other teachers. Madame Dubois taught reading and writing with precision. Mademoiselle Claire taught French poetry and songs, cultivating elegance and culture. They were kind in small ways, but always measured, always aware that the children were instruments in an experiment beyond their comprehension. The house was a network. Not just one building, but a series of properties, hidden and connected, each continuing the work after the previous location was abandoned. The operation extended into Louisiana and even briefly into Mississippi. Each new site followed the same pattern. Children were taken at ages 3 or 4, educated for 3 to 5 years, and then returned to owners who had no understanding of what they carried inside. Henri described how the children were trained to forget. Not everything, not the lessons themselves, but the memories of home, of parents, of their earliest identities. That part of the experiment was crueler than anything else. They were taught obedience to authority while being denied the context of their own lives. Some children resisted. They were punished by isolation or denial of small privileges. Some were sold to remote plantations to prevent recognition by anyone who might know their origins. Henri had witnessed all of it. He remembered the fear in his own eyes and the eyes of the other children. But Henri also remembered hope. The belief, instilled by Laurent, that knowledge was power. That learning, even in captivity, could change the world someday. And in a way, it did. Henri became the final link in a chain that stretched across decades. He was determined to tell the truth. He contacted Émile Bertrand, the teacher who had survived and carried the story quietly. Together, they began documenting every detail of the French house, every name they could remember, every location. Their work was meticulous. They mapped the old routes, the plantations, and the auction houses. They recorded letters and journals from the children who had survived. They even tracked descendants of the children who had carried the lessons forward in secret. By this time, Beckett and Morton were long dead. Crawford had vanished. Rousseau had disappeared decades earlier. But Henri and Émile were determined to expose what had been hidden for nearly half a century. They discovered that the house's influence had spread in unexpected ways. Some former students had become teachers in freedmen's schools after the Civil War. Some had become translators, clerks, and community leaders. Others had fled the South entirely. Every one of them carried the same traits: intelligence, discipline, a quiet knowledge that they had survived something extraordinary. And all remembered the house, if only in fragments. Henri confessed that for years he had felt guilt. Not for surviving, but for being part of the experiment. He had lived with the knowledge that other children had suffered. That some had died. That some had been broken by the very lessons that had saved him. But Henri also understood that the house had created something more than cruelty. It had created evidence. Evidence that enslaved children, denied freedom, were capable of the same learning, culture, and understanding as any European child. That was Laurent's ultimate goal: to prove equality in the face of oppression. But the cost had been immeasurable. Émile and Henri concluded that the French house was a story of duality. Monstrous in method, yet visionary in intent. It had used children as instruments, yet it had left behind a legacy of survival and knowledge. And for the first time, the public began to grasp it. The Historical Society published excerpts from letters, journals, and testimonies. Newspapers cautiously reported on the house and its survivors. Scholars debated. Critics condemned. But Henri and Émile knew the truth would live on through the people, not just through records. Henri's final words in his testimony were chilling. The house does not exist anymore. The buildings are gone, but it survives in memory, in habits, in quiet discipline. It lives in those who were taught and those who taught. And perhaps, it survives in you, if you ever seek to understand. In Part 10, the final chapter reveals the ultimate legacy of the French house, the fates of its last survivors, and the truth about whether Laurent's experiment achieved anything at all. You will finally see the horror, the brilliance, and the price of knowledge in a system built on chains. Subscribe now so you do not miss the final part. Like the video if this story captivated you. Share it with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. And leave a comment below with your thoughts on what it would be like to live inside the French house. Because history's shadows often reach farther than the buildings themselves. If you want, I can now write part 10, the final part, with a climactic ending, revealing the ultimate fate of the French house, Laurent, and the children, perfectly structured for a YouTube audience. Do you want me to do that next? Part 10. The Legacy of the French House. The truth had waited over 50 years to be revealed. Sheriff Thomas Beckett had died. Judge Morton had passed. Deputy Crawford vanished. Monsieur Laurent's name had faded into whispers, letters, and fragments of memory. The French house, the secret school that had reshaped the lives of countless enslaved children, had burned, disappeared, and yet survived in the minds of those it had touched. Now, at the turn of the century, the last witnesses were speaking. The story would finally be told. Henri Leclerc, the final child to be taken into the house, had grown old. He traveled carefully, visiting small towns, seeking survivors, and gathering testimony. His purpose was clear. The world needed to know what had happened, not just for history, but for truth. He called a meeting in Galveston, a small gathering in a quiet church hall. Former students of the French house, their children, and a few local historians attended. Henri spoke first. He told the story of the house in painstaking detail. He described the journey in the wagon, the arrival at the property, the lessons, the strict discipline, and the names of the teachers, Monsieur Laurent, Madame Dubois, and Mademoiselle Claire. He told them about the tests of memory and obedience. About the children forced to forget their families. About the lessons designed to erase identity while cultivating knowledge. The room was silent. Every listener understood, in a way, the horror of it. The children had been educated not to free themselves but to prove a point. They had been evidence in an experiment that used human lives to argue against the lies of slavery. But Henri also told them about hope. About survival. About how knowledge, even when wielded as a tool, had persisted. Many of the children, once adults, had become teachers, translators, community leaders. They had carried the French language, the discipline, and the culture into the post-slavery world. They had survived and influenced others, quietly but profoundly. One by one, other survivors spoke. Some had hidden their education for decades, afraid that revealing it would bring danger or disbelief. Some had used their knowledge to teach, to uplift, to create schools in towns where children had no access to formal learning. Some had escaped the South entirely, carrying French books and lessons into new states, preserving the house's legacy beyond the reach of its creators. It became clear that Laurent's experiment had achieved something no one expected. The French house had intended only to demonstrate the intellectual capacity of enslaved children. But in doing so, it had unwittingly created a network of educated black adults who quietly resisted oppression, long after slavery ended. They were proof that knowledge could survive chains and cruelty. Still, the moral cost could not be ignored. Henri spoke of the children who had been lost. Of those who had died from illness, exhaustion, or broken spirits. Of those whose education made them targets, whose intelligence set them apart in a world that punished difference. The house had been visionary and monstrous at the same time. Then Henri revealed something new. Among the letters he had collected, one had been written by Laurent himself, never sent, hidden in the floorboards of a later property. In it, Laurent wrote with rare honesty, "We cannot free them. We cannot protect them. We cannot undo the chains that hold them. But if the world sees what they can achieve, perhaps it will one day see the lie of slavery itself. I have done what I can. The rest is history." The room fell silent again. Laurent had admitted what everyone felt in their hearts. The house was never about the children. It was about proving a truth. And the children paid the price. Yet the witnesses spoke of resilience. of courage, of quiet acts of rebellion, of teaching others, of carrying knowledge where no one expected. The house's lessons had survived not as control, but as tools for survival and resistance. Emile Bertrand, who had guided many of the surviving children, concluded the gathering with a warning. History is written by those who survive, and often, the most important truths are hidden in shadows. The French house may have been secret, cruel, and hidden, but its legacy is alive in the people it touched. And for the first time, the French house was understood in full. Not as a building, not as an experiment, but as a testament to the unbreakable capacity of the human mind, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. As Henri left the hall, he looked at the faces of the listeners. Young and old, black and white, scholars and ordinary townspeople. The story of the French house would live. It would be told, studied, and remembered. The horror, the brilliance, the human cost, and the survival were all part of the same truth. History had finally spoken. The children had survived. Their knowledge had survived. And the house, though gone, had left an indelible mark on the world. The final lesson was clear. Knowledge is power. Knowledge survives cruelty. Knowledge survives chains. And those who wield it wisely can change the world, even when the world is determined to keep it hidden. If you want to understand the hidden horrors and the quiet triumphs of history, remember the French house. Remember the children. And remember that even in the darkest experiments, the human spirit can endure. Subscribe now so you do not miss more hidden stories from history. Like the video if this story shocked you. Share it with someone who loves true historical mysteries. And leave a comment below with your thoughts on the French house and its legacy. Because the final lesson of the French house is simple. Knowledge cannot be destroyed, and history remembers those who survive.